The views and opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of Access Fort Wayne, the Allen County Public Library, or any other supporting groups. If you'd like to produce a show, call us at 260-421-1250.
Let me be your lighthouse so I can show you the way. Let me be your shining light, I'll keep you from drifting away. I'm the one that makes you try when...
This is Patty Hunter, Patty's Page. Today I have a special guest. His name is Jim Pickett. Hello, Jim.
Hello, Patty.
Hello.
Wait a second. Patty Hunter? I thought it was Patty Page. I told my wife I was going to be on the Patty Page show, and she thought that she was a singer. So here we are, but it's Patty Hunter. Okay, that we can still do this.
We
okay.
can still work with
I'll work with you, even though we were expecting Patty Page, but that's the name of the show, right?
Hey, on the phone is my co-host Terrence Doran, or Terry Doran. How are you, Ter?
Hello, Patty. Hi, Jim.
Hi, Terry.
Have we got questions for Jim, eh?
Yep, fire away. Betty's ready for him.
So, what would you like to ask?
Well, I would just ask him how did you get started with local history, Jim? What prompted you?
Good question. The name of the book is The Bones of Kekionga, and I remember as a kid growing up in New Haven, there were times going into Fort Wayne with my mom for shopping. I would notice some plaques and things that marked some of the historical places around Fort Wayne, and so it kind of stirred the interest there, as well as back in the 50s and 60s there were some terrific television shows, the Daniel Boone and the Davy Crockett series that went on, and that kind of stirred the interest in history, and you always had the John Wayne movies and things that were on in the theaters that stirred interest, and then but I kind of forgot about local history until I got into a little bit of retirement, so I kind of put it behind me, although it was still there. And once I retired about 6 years ago from teaching school, I kind of looked into it a little bit more and visited some of the spots that I remember from my childhood, and just dove into it a little bit more, and I thought, man, this might make a good book. And so the more I did the research, I had over 60 sources trying to get a good background of what was going on in the Fort Wayne area, and especially the Lakeside district of Fort Wayne. And I said, I don't think many people know our heritage here in the Fort Wayne area and the things that have taken place prior to the building of the actual fort. Everybody remembers Anthony Wayne built the fort in 1794, but what were some of the things that took place prior to that? And one of those was what this book kind of focuses on, was Harmar's campaign. There was a guy by the name of General Josiah Harmar that brought an army up from Cincinnati, which was the home of Fort Washington, and through the orders of our first president, George Washington, came up here with about a 1,500-man army. And the issue was, at that time, in 1790, the Revolutionary War had been over for about 7 years, and we were having some issues with the Native Americans, having problems with early settlers coming down the Ohio River. And so a lot of this kind of came together, and so getting back to your original question, one thing leads to another. When you have an interest like history, I wasn't a history teacher, although I did for a while major in history at the University of St. Francis, but I taught all subjects when I was doing my teaching career at the 6th grade level, mostly in the Calb Central School District, just north
Well,
of
that's
here.
great, and your book, that title is, I love your title, and I think it's very riveting and indicative of what you're writing about. I mean, this is a history that, as you said, is forgotten, and most people don't even know about it. So you're really doing a great thing by bringing awareness to the public on this.
Well, thank you, Terry. You know, a lot of the things that I got, the Bones of Kekionga, there were construction workers building homes in the lakeside area back in the late 1800s and early 1900s that were uncovering bones and skeletons from the early settlers. And some of them were from this particular battle that we're talking about, sometimes called Harmar's Defeat, also known as the Battle of Kekionga. And so when these construction workers, found these bones, one thing leads to another. Do you report it? Do you not report it? So I kind of bring that out in the book a little bit. People had jobs to do. It's kind of like what it is today. People don't want anything to hold up construction or anything like that, but we're even finding things today, aren't we?
I'm sure. I think the entire city is probably filled with bones of the past, with Indian cemeteries, burial sites. And, I grew up in Indian Village, and always was rumored that was an Indian burial site and that it was haunted. And, I've heard a lot about that sort of thing. And again, getting back to your title, I mean, it's it's sort of a metaphor, but also tangible, as you say. They actually dug up bones, and probably if you went over there and started digging, there'd still be some arrowheads, all kinds of things in this area. Do you think, as a former teacher, how would you suggest that your book, your research, what you know, the awareness, would be introduced into our school system classrooms?
I'm not sure it's not being. I teach driver ed. I'm still teaching. I haven't totally retired from Safeway driving school, and if I have a pretty good driver, I try to strike up conversations, because you got to be able to drive and talk at the same time. So as
you don't have a good driver.
Yeah, well, we don't talk about local history, but it's about their 3rd or 4th hour and 6th hour of driving. It's a 6-hour lessons.
Whoa.
We're going through the lakeside area, and I'll ask them, "Do you know what happened in here?" And 9 times out of the 10, no. And I may ask them, "Well, do you know about Kekionga?" And usually their response is, "You mean Kekionga Middle School?" And I said, "No, this used to be," and I'll go into a little bit of rendition of what took place in the lakeside area known as Kekionga. And but I had one student that actually told me more than I knew. They had a teacher that brought them down on a school bus, brought their whole class down. I forget which school it was.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, so they did some stop-offs at some of the markers there along Edgewater Avenue. And so he informed me a little bit while he drove. So that was a good experience there. I was glad to hear that some word about our local history is getting out there.
The Miami tribe, how many were there before they were driven out?
Oh my gosh. We're probably talking about maybe, centuries of Indian tribes fluctuating in and out of the Middle West. A number, put it on that. You had disease going on, you had wars going on between tribes and Native Americans. So, smallpox was bad time in the 1740s and 50s. So I think at this time, 1790, if I put a number on the Kekionga village itself, let's take a look at the number of shelters there were. Through my research, in the Kekionga area, right there in Lakeside, was around 58 shelters, wigwams, frame houses actually, because we had French as well as some British living among them. On the west side of the St. Joe River, in the Prospect Wagner area, street area, there was probably 30 shelters and homes. Let's go up the river. Let's go up the Maumee River to a place called Chillicothe. Chillicothe had 58 on one side of the river, and 15, Delaware, were on the south side of the Maumee River. Now Chillicothe was about 2 miles upriver toward the Lakeside Golf Course, where the Catholic Cemetery is now. Just south of the Catholic Cemetery, between the cemetery and the river, was a village called Chillicothe. A lot of people I've talked to don't even realize that, and that comes into play in the book. Up the St. Joe River to IPFW, there was another area there where there was around 36 villages, or 36 shelters of a village. Let's go down the St. Mary's River to Foster Park and the Sweeney Park area. You're talking about another 30. So there were scatterings of villages around. So if we had to put a total in, maybe a couple thousand, Miami, but you also have to throw in the Delaware as well as the Shawnee that lived among the Miami Indians as well. So.
Right. So it was really a sort of like a federation of different tribes in this area, with Miami being the most prominent. And of course, the battle that you mentioned was led by the Miami chief Little Turtle.
Yes, Little Turtle. We talked about Little Turtle.
Defeated Harmar.
And Josiah Harmar was the main character, I guess you'd say, the leader of the American force, the new American force,
right,
coming up from Fort Washington. So yeah, Little Turtle was an interesting character. Great sense of humor. From my research, I found that he was a great orator. He was a motivator. He was against alcohol. He knew that was an issue with the Native Americans, and against slavery as well. All those things I tried to bring out in the book. The book is more of an adventure. I didn't want it to be a history book. I wanted it to be an adventure story that had history in it. It's a historical fiction. I've added some characters to it, some fictional characters that hopefully bring out some of the things that took place among the common people that were involved in this battle, as well as the military. And the book covers both sides of it. I made one chapter was going to cover the Native Americans and what was going on in their livelihoods a month or 2 months prior to the battle. And on the other side, a chapter will talk about the new Americans that were coming down the river from western Pennsylvania. The militia were called up from western Pennsylvania. About 350 of them were brought in. And then as well as the Kentucky County, that wasn't even the state of Kentucky in 1790. It was a couple years later it became the state of Kentucky. So that's Virginia. So we've got about 800 coming from there, militia, to join with Harmar, who's at Fort Washington at this time, with about 350 to 400 of his own federal troops. We didn't have much of a standing army back then, maybe 1,000 total, believe it or not. So our Congress was relying on the people, just like they did in the Revolutionary War, to volunteer as militia to help a cause. And the cause George Washington had, and many in Congress, was settling the Northwest Territory for our settlers. The Native Americans had a different idea about that. There were friendly Native Americans. There were some that were not so friendly because their initiative was to keep their land as their own. And the British didn't help much. They were instigators as well because they'd lost the Revolutionary War, but as we found out later in the War of 1812, they weren't done in giving up this land to this new country called the United States.
Wow.
You know, the fascinating thing is that this history of this area is so crucial to the founding of the United States because it paved the way for westward expansion and fighting Indians out west. But I think there's a really sad element to it as well, because the indigenous people were living here and we did invade them, and that's the sad part about it. But do you think there was a way that it could have been solved, Jim, without warfare, or do you think it was inevitable from your research?
From my research, there were Native Americans that were peaceful and were willing to live among the new United States citizens coming down the Ohio River and on flatboats and willing to live among them. We had some reaching out by our Congress. They sent delegates into this area in the 1780s, meeting with Native Americans, the chief of each of the tribes. Some of the delegates from Congress were met peacefully, and a lot of negotiations went on, and you had the Treaty of Fort McIntosh and the Treaty of Fort Harmar that would have allowed settlers to come in and live among the Native Americans. But you also had those on the other side, and some of these people will show up in the book. As far as Little Turtle was concerned, this was the Miami land. You had Blue Jacket of the Shawnees involved. Tecumseh wasn't real pleased about the new settlers coming in. Chief Legree, who was right here in Lakeside area, Kekionga, was not too pleased about the new Americans coming in here. So some of the negotiators from our Congress, from the United States Congress, didn't make it back to Washington. Or actually, Washington wasn't the capital then. New York was the capital of our country at that time. So there was, it was, they took their lives in their own hands as they came in to try to negotiate, not knowing which tribes were going to be friendly, which ones were going to be their enemy. And so that kind of kept things stirred up. You had both sides thought they were right. We just won the Revolutionary War. During the Revolutionary War in 1780, George Rogers Clark made a venture up to Piqua, Ohio, and there was a battle over there, Battle of Piqua. Daniel Boone and Simon Kenton were involved in that. So, but that didn't settle things down. In fact, it probably stirred things up more. So it wasn't until 1790 that Washington said, that's enough. We've got a lot of money invested in the Northwest Territory, which was made up of Indiana and Wisconsin and Ohio and Michigan and Illinois, and a lot of land speculators that had some investments made, and that kind of initiated, money of course kind of leads things to one way to another. So in that respect, Washington said, we've got to put a stop to all this unsettlement and settle this land, and that's when Josiah Harmar was brought into the picture to try to settle things down. Josiah Harmar was an interesting character. He's kind of labeled a loser, but of course Harmar's defeat. But the guy had a great background. He was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. He fought with George Washington. He was in Valley Forge during the issue with the winter. He knew Nathaniel Greene and fought with him. He was also a delegate that crossed the Atlantic Ocean by ship with the peace treaty with the British at the end of the Revolutionary War. Met with Ben Franklin, and Franklin, of course, they went on to Paris, France, where they met King Louis XVI and the Queen there as well. And he brought the treaty back from France to the United States. So his background is, pretty good background there. So he was chosen to go along the Ohio River and take some of his troops that he had actually trained. There's about 1,000 federal troops. That was our standing army. That's all we had back then. And he took about 400 or 500 of them down the Ohio River, across the Pennsylvania landscape, and down the Ohio River from Pittsburgh, mostly by flatboat. And then they built Fort Washington in the Cincinnati area. So his job was to protect the new settlers coming down the Ohio River by flatboat, and he built some. Also built Fort Harmar, and McIntosh was up by Pittsburgh. And earlier, they thought the forts being built there were going to prevent settlers from settling in the Ohio land. In fact, the settlers had another idea. They thought the forts were there to protect them from the Native Americans. So there's kind of a switcheroo on that. But so Harmar had a good background there. But once he had the word from Washington that he needed to take an army to Miamitown, which was kind of considered the capital of the Miami nation at that time, as well as the Shawnee were around and the Delaware were around, that's when patrolling the Ohio River, that actually became a little bit more dangerous for settlers coming down there, because they knew that the military, their presence wasn't really taking place much. But they had to gather this army. You had the Western Pennsylvanians, about 350 coming down by flatboat, and you had the Kentuckians coming in to Fort Washington, and it was up to Harmar. He didn't have much time. This is in September of 1790. The battle, by the way, the final Battle of Kekionga, took place October 22nd. You're talking about a 2-week excursion up from Fort Washington to the Miamitown, and you got a 1,453 man army. You also had a couple hundred, 200 to 250 camp followers. Soldiers at that time, and even some militia, would bring their families along, and they would follow along behind. And some of them would do the clothes washing. Some of them would do the cooking and taking care of the minor things that needed to be done. They also brought along, this army also brought along 3 pieces of cannon, a 6-pounder, a 3-pounder, and a 5.5-inch howitzer with it, 578 pack horses carrying their gears. I always thought maybe they had a wagon. It's like a wagon train coming up here like the old Western days. No, it was pack horses. They brought 175 herd of cattle with them that they would butcher along the way to feed this army at that time. They would travel about 10 miles a day, kind of depending on the terrain. So we're talking about a 2-week excursion that left around the end of September and made their way north to nowadays Fort Wayne and the Kekionga area, which is lakeside. So that's adventure in itself.
The canal boats, when was that?
The Canal Era was around 1840s, if I know my history of that era. And they dug some of the canals, and then, Fort Wayne. Yeah, that's the Wabash and Erie Canal you're talking about. So that's another 50 years later that even comes into play as far as that part of our history, which is an amazing thing as well. I think we just got great, I think you guys agree, we got a lot of heritage around here, a lot of great history that people really appreciate, and some people aren't totally aware of that. Hopefully this book will bring out.
Well, Jim, hearing you talk, you're really putting a human face on all this. I mean, you read and it records as a battle. You don't think of the pack horses, the family, doing the wash, all that's involved to even get here.
Yes.
Let alone the battle itself. So
yes,
it's a great contribution, I think.
Such bravery too, and they're going into an area they know it's hostile, And some of these younger, the makeup of the Army, at that time, Harmar didn't have a whole lot of time to train this Army up. His troops, he took about 320 federal troops up here, but he also had over 1,000 militia that didn't get trained up that well. He didn't have enough time. Anthony Wayne took his time, which made his venture, 3 or 4 years later, a little bit more successful. But Harmar didn't have a whole lot of time to train him up, but he did he did the best he could in that respect. And so when they started marching up here, it was a little rough. Some of the militia, were used to doing their own raids and on the Native Americans, and so he had to deal with that. The keeping track of the pack horses during the venture up, the Native Americans were harassing them a little bit, some of the hostile ones. Some of the pack horses were stolen at night. Some of our militia that weren't trained very well fell asleep once in a while. Some of the cattle ended up coming up missing. Anything to harass an army this size was going on. We had scouts. From my research, I only came across one particular scout. I know he had more, but Daniel Williams was the chief scout that kind of led the way at that time. And but there were others. And keep in mind also, the Iroquois and the Miami didn't get along. So I added an Iroquois Indian into this force to help as a scout as well.
Pastor? Was there pastors?
Well, that's another thing that entered my mind. Once in a while you get, you kind of dry, you get dry in your writing, and it was like, what am I going to do to keep going? I sent out chapters to people to read, and I would get comments, you're putting in too much detail, and you're adding, that was one of the big issues, because I wanted to be a book that's readable. Some people like thick books. I mean, I probably could have made this 600 or 700 pages if I wanted to really develop each of the characters, but it's small enough that I'm looking at the young kids. It's like these 15-year-olds that I'm teaching how to drive. I want them to read it. It's it's not that long, but it's not that short. It gets to the, it moves. I wanted it to move. And some of the comments I got from people who were reading chapters at the time, it was a little bit, too many details. So then I got stuck, and then it's like, what's gonna add to this? And so I came across the idea, and God kind of gave this to me, and a lot of this is, I give all the glory to God. I mean, this is a God-given story. I mean, from a God-given imagination. I've never written anything before. And so he helped out, and he says, you needed, and this is through a prayer, he said, you need to add a pastor. And so we've got a military pastor going along the way, and he's going to be there when he's needed. He's always going to be around, but once in a while when things got kind of rough, afterwards he was there to help out those that were having some problems with the loss of loved ones.
Godspeed, my love, until we meet again. You're always in my heart and every dream. Don't let this time apart give in to all our fears. God will keep us close from up above. So until we meet again, Godspeed, my love. God is with us all.